Hello everyone. Tonight we're stepping into a place where the bedroom is not just a space for intimacy, it's a battlefield of power, where moans are controlled like oaths of loyalty. We'll explore the life behind the curtains of Henry VIII, a king who was both lustful and impotent, ready to kill anyone who dared look at him without trembling. And the truth is, if you were ever summoned to his bed, you weren't just risking your honor, but your head. Before you lean back comfortably, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel, but only if you genuinely enjoy the content I share, and leave a comment letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is there. It's fascinating to see people following from all over the world. Now, turn off the lights, maybe switch on a fan for some background noise, and let's dive into tonight's journey together. Tonight we're entering a place where even the candlelight trembles in fear, the bedroom of King Henry VIII. Forget classical music, romantic whispers, and rose-strewn beds. This is a place where the stench of sweat, power, and dried blood lingers in every curtain. Imagine you're not a queen, not a noble, not even a lover. You're just the summoned, a lady in waiting, a courtier, someone pretty enough or foolish enough not to know how to say no. The order comes at midnight. The king wishes to see you. No one asks your opinion. No one cares if you're asleep or feverish. A guard leads you through cold stone corridors, walls adorned with shields and animal heads. Your heart races, not from excitement, but from survival instinct. You've heard the stories of those summoned who never return, of those cast out in the middle of the night, just for not being fragrant enough, or for not knowing how to stay silent. The door opens, the room is dark. A massive figure, like a mountain, sits waiting amidst silk sheets and sheepskin. It's him, King Henry, his eyes half awake, half drunk, half hungry, half bored. You step in, hands trembling, head bowed. No one taught you how to speak in a room where power can kill in silence. And then he points to the bed. No greeting, no smile, just the truth. You're no longer a person. You're an object. And tonight he will inspect that object. You don't know what will happen. You only know one thing. From this moment, your life is no longer in your hands. And if you think this is the scariest part, wait until you hear what happens when the king is displeased. Because the truth is, it all began long before your name was called, back when he was young, back when all of Europe admired Henry as the ideal king, intelligent, authoritative, and so full of vigor that royal physicians worried his body produced too much carnal heat. You know the Henry of now, a colossal figure with festering legs and eyes full of discontent. But the Henry of 20 years ago was an entirely different creature, a biological machine fueled by red meat, hunting, music, fencing, and an unshakable belief that he was born to be loved, desired, and obeyed. When his father died in 1509, Henry was just 17. Golden hair, blue eyes, perfect teeth, and a smile like a knight stepping out of a painting. He wasn't just a king, he was the living symbol of the Tudor era, young, strong, aggressive, and brimming with a thirst for conquest, both on the battlefield and in the bedroom. Don't imagine a lethargic king lounging on a throne issuing commands. No, young Henry rode horses to hunt every morning, played tennis every afternoon, danced, sang, painted, played the lute, and composed hymns. He even wrote love poetry, later discovered to be used as ammunition to target noble women. For Henry, sex was never just about pleasure. It was an extension of power, a territory he had to claim, requisition, and stamp his mark upon every body he touched. Princesses, countesses, ladies in waiting, all were taught to bow their heads when they saw Henry. But he wanted them to bow in bed too, and they often did, because they were afraid, because they had no choice, and sometimes because they too believed lying with Henry was a privilege, like being granted a share of sacred royal blood. By his 20s, Henry was described as the embodiment of St. George, muscles carved from marble, broad shoulders, thick thighs, a voice as deep as war drums. His courtiers described him as a man whose vitality poured from every pore. The era's concept of masculinity was tied to bedroom prowess, and Henry knew it. He didn't just want heirs. He wanted everyone to know he could produce heirs any time, with anyone. Under his reign, sports tournaments, fencing matches, or drinking feasts all had an unspoken goal: to showcase the abundance of royal vigor. And who witnessed that vigor up close? The women, lined up on the list of those granted access to the emperor's body. These women aren't named in history books, but they existed as shadows in the palace corridors. The terrifying truth is, no one dared refuse young Henry. To refuse was to defy divine will, and though Henry could charm with poetry, humor, or smiles, beneath it all lay a cold metal edge. If you didn't comply, you'd be crushed. Sex in Henry's youth was like a scripted hunting game. He'd approach, smile, sing, send gifts. If you smiled back, you'd signed your own summons to the bedroom. If you evaded, your family might be expelled from court, taxed into ruin, or simply disappear. Worse, sometimes, he didn't bother with games, just a pointed finger. And that night, you belonged to him. In his early reign, Henry loved himself more than anyone else. In every act of intimacy, he wasn't seeking emotion. He was seeking validation, that he was beautiful, that he was strong, that he was invincible. Women who made him feel that way were rewarded. Those who didn't were discarded, like used handkerchiefs. And you know the most terrifying thing? Those women didn't die right away. They lived to carry memories no one believed, lived to become the one who lay with the king, a title that made them both revered and despised. Now, looking at the massive figure looming on the bed, you see one thing clearly: the Henry of today is a warped product of young Henry, a machine of desire that burned itself out with unchecked lust. And tonight, you're just another link in the long chain of those swallowed by the Empire's bedroom. But don't worry, you might survive, as long as you don't displease him, as long as you know when to flatter, as long as you understand that Henry isn't seeking love, he's seeking proof that he's still desirable. And if you make him doubt that history shows, you won't get a second chance to make it right. Because for Henry VIII, sex wasn't just a pastime or carnal passion, it was a battlefield, a soft strategy cloaked in red velvet and white silk, but with razor-sharp political daggers inside. His body, more precisely, his robust, masculine, seemingly boundless body, was a political weapon, honed as meticulously as any sword in his armory. You think a king rules with words, laws, or armies? Not wrong, but Henry also used his sexuality as instinctive diplomacy. With men, he imposed rivalry, making everyone feel less masculine than him. With women, he turned them into territories to conquer. With the entire court, he revealed just enough to let everyone know: the king is virile, the king is robust, the king can create an immortal dynasty. That was true, or at least he made everyone believe it was true. In the Tudor court, the king's reproductive strength was tied to the kingdom's prosperity. A king who could sire many sons was a divine blessing. An impotent king was an omen, a cause for courtly chaos, a seed for civil war. Henry understood this early on, and he turned every flex of his muscles, every lift of a wine goblet, every deer-hunting ride, into a grand performance of masculine prowess. It wasn't by chance that courtly feasts followed an unwritten ritual. After a few rounds of drinks, Henry would roll up his sleeves, lift his cloak, reveal his biceps, and wrestle, fence, or dance until sweat sprayed. French diplomats once recorded, no one could beat the king at arm wrestling, but what truly terrified people was how he laughed while winning. In his marriages, Henry's body was a bargaining chip. He often personally chose wives or mistresses from foreign princesses, but he also sent them portraits of himself. Not cloaked in robes, but bare-chested, sword in hand, chest puffed, eyes blazing. Such paintings were sent to courts in Spain, France, Germany, as a message: I'm not just a king, I'm a superior male. In royal politics, where marriage was a treaty, being more desirable could tip the scales of power. Even when Henry presided over trials or council meetings, he used his body as evidence. Once, during a debate about whether the Pope could decide his divorce, Henry stood, slammed his hand on the table, and roared, "I'm the only man in England who can make this nation thrive." No one dared speak further. But this display wasn't just for show. It served a greater purpose: to hide a deep-seated fear. Henry feared weakness, feared people thinking he wasn't strong enough to hold the throne, feared rumors from the harem that last night he couldn't perform, feared he couldn't produce a son, and that fear drove him to thrust his body forward like a shield against the truth. A king could be weak in morals, strategy, even sanity, but not in bed. Those who lived in the court understood implicitly: if the king was irrationally angry, something went wrong last night. If he unusually favored someone, they'd done something in bed. to make him feel still a useful male. And if he didn't appear for days, everyone knew not to ask, because he might be in his room, alone, wrestling with the shame of not being able to rise. Starting to see it? Every time Henry embraced someone, it wasn't just to satisfy desire, it was an unspoken contract. You will make me believe I'm still king, still a man, and you'll live if you do it well. In that world, physical touch was a form of governance. A kiss could determine a family's fate. A night in bed could spark a war. History often calls Henry the eccentric with many wives, the obese tyrant, but look closer, and you'll see a man sickened by being trapped in a warped definition of masculine power. He never dared sit still without showing off, fearing silence would betray him. He never slept soundly, because his only dream was a nightmare, the entire country laughing at his private parts. And that's why, even as his body rotted day by day, Henry insisted on playing the role of the ever-ready king, even if it was a lie, even if it was desperate, even if those summoned to his bedroom, like you, were no longer people, but mirrors reflecting the insecurities of a man who refused to age. But you're still lucky, because at least tonight, the king still wants to perform. It's only when he falls silent, when his body has nothing left to prove, that's when you're truly in danger. Because a king who can no longer wield his strongest political weapon often does the most horrific things to prove he's still in control. And history records, blood flows most not after wars, but after a night when the king realizes he's become impotent. But there's another thing that enraged Henry VIII as much as his failure to perform, when someone, especially a woman, showed disgust at his body odor. It sounds trivial, but in an era ignorant of deodorant or body spray, smell was power. And for Henry, nothing stung more than someone coughing lightly as they entered his bed or wrinkling their nose when his breath touched their skin. The Tudor era had no French perfumes, no roll-on deodorants, wet wipes, shampoos, or anything you take for granted. The closest thing to fragrance Henry used was a mix of deer fat, ambergris, resin, herbal ash, and a dash of strong liquor, smeared directly on his skin after bathing. That is, wiping down with a cloth dipped in cold water once a week. In his early years, when he was young and vigorous, his body still exuded a manly scent that many women of the time described as intoxicating, like spring forest smoke. But that was when they were still enchanted by his power. Later, as excess flesh, ulcers, and breath smelling of dried blood appeared, the king's odor became a biological weapon, one no one dared speak of truthfully, but everyone knew was horrific. The king's body, by modern standards, was a breeding ground for stench. He had chronic ulcers on his left leg, oozing pus and reeking like spoiled meat, pickled in salt. He rarely bathed, only changed his silk undergarments every few days, and believed sweat was proof of health. To mask it, servants had to mix resin with animal fat, heat it until it melted, and apply it to sensitive areas of his body, from wrists, ankles to groin, neck, and behind both ears. When the mixture cooled, it hardened like glue, forming a thick wax layer on his skin, making him look like he was coated in glossy paint. But really, it was a layer hiding biological decay. And you, the one just led into his room, can smell it from the third corridor. It's not like any perfume, because it's not pleasant. It's just heavy, heavy enough to choke, heavy as if every air molecule screams, "He's here." As you near the bed, you don't just smell it, you feel it. It clings to your hair, crawls into your nose, settles on your lips. And if you flinch, even slightly, the king's eyes will dart up, narrow, and you'll know instantly you're in a gamble where your sense of smell has no right to be honest. It's not that Henry didn't know he smelled. On the contrary, he was obsessed with being seen as desirable, to the point of ordering custom fragrant blends. Once, he began using a mix of olive oil, ground ginger, black pepper, eucalyptus resin, and aged goat semen. Every morning, servants would rub it evenly over his body, then sprinkle lavender powder on his hair, tying leather straps around his thighs to seal in royal allure. He believed a strong scent was proof of vitality, and anyone who suggested otherwise, whether courtier or physician, was banished to the borderlands or disappeared. There's an anecdote, passed down but never recorded in official history, that one night, a young lady in waiting, summoned to the king's room for the first time, let out a faint gag when kissing his hand, just a soft irk. The next morning, She was gone. No one found her body. But from then on, other girls learned a lesson. If you couldn't praise the king's scent, at least praise its nobility. Some willingly sacrificed their noses, skin, and health to get close, because being favored by the king, even for a few nights, could transform a family's fortune. A gift, a plot of land, a title. In return, they just had to survive nights, thick with the stench of ambergris, mixed with leg pus and fermenting flesh. Henry's odor didn't just linger in the bedroom, it followed him to court. At receptions, he often exuded a pungent scent, like tar mixed with pine resin. Ambassadors discreetly noted that sitting near him was a physical challenge, not just from political pressure, but from the distinctive flavor of Tudor power. And the most dangerous part, he thought they were complimenting him. Once, when Henry was gravely ill, physicians suggested stopping the use of fragrant oils to let the body breathe. The result? 2 doctors were banished, one lost his position, and the entire team of attendants was replaced within 3 days. After that, no one dared mention smell again. Only whispers remained. As long as he believes he smells good, we're safe. For you tonight, the question isn't, will I attract the king? The real question is, can I endure his smell long enough not to vomit? And if you think that's the hardest part, you're wrong. The smell is just the beginning, because after that, you'll face the sounds, the sights, and the intimate behaviors no one ever speaks of aloud. And worse, you have to pretend to enjoy them, because a smile at the wrong moment could make you fall from the bed. Not the bed of sleep, the bed of power, and no one who fell from it ever lived to tell the tale. Because the line between being favored and being punished in Henry VIII's bedroom is thinner than a hair. And if there's one place that most clearly embodies the power, fear, and absolute isolation of the man called the lustful monarch, it's the massive bed at the heart of Hampton Court Palace, where you stand now, where his smell still lingers in every silk thread, every wooden crevice. Not an ordinary bed, not something you've seen in movies or imagined in fairy tales. Henry's bed is over 3 meters wide, nearly 4 meters long, so tall it requires its own staircase to climb. Built from rare black oak, carved with dragons, lions, phoenixes, none of them gentle, all bearing teeth, raising claws, as if ready to tear apart anyone who lies in the wrong position. And as rumored, it could hold 3 prisoners without them touching each other. The curtains around the bed are as thick as armor, woven with velvet, gold thread, and royal symbols. Once closed, they create a private world where no one can see, no one can hear, and no one may enter without permission. It's not just a bed, it's the king's absolute domain. A miniature kingdom where no law exists, but his desire. You might think, a big bed, so what? But what makes this place a nightmare is the space. Space so vast, you feel small enough to vanish. Vast enough for a man like Henry to lie in the center, and you don't know whether to approach or keep your distance. Vast enough for every movement, every breath of his to echo like thunder, making you flinch, tremble, unsure if the next touch is a caress or a punishment. Henry doesn't lie in bed like a normal man. He reigns in it, propped on thick goose feather mattresses, back against a mountain of pillows, covered in silk sheets embroidered with crosses and intricate Celtic patterns you dare not stare at too long. On either side of the bed, 2 giant candles burn, not for light, but for shadow. Every time he moves, his colossal silhouette looms on the wall like a brooding god ruling the underworld. And you, the summoned, are merely a sacrifice. Rumors say that in the king's bed, everything has ears. The curtains have tiny holes for spies to peek through. The pillows have hollows hiding letters. There's even a secret passage from the bed to a hidden chamber where the king could summon a courtier in the dead of night with a single pull of a silk cord, meaning nothing is private, not even your breath. For Henry, the bed isn't a place of rest. It's a courtroom. Many decisions, big and small, were made while he lay there, naked, exhausted, after a failure or success on someone else's body. Some were granted titles after a night of pleasing him. Some were exiled to the borders for accidentally letting a foot slip off his sheets, and some were executed for lying too still, making the king suspect they were plotting to kill him in his sleep. Yet the cruelest part is the pretense. You must know how to act. Act without being too forward, lest you be seen as wanton. Act without being too passive, lest you be seen as unpleasing. You must moan at the right intensity, breathe at the right rhythm, move just enough for the king to think you're in sync, but not so much that he thinks you're trying to control the game. It's a performance so precise that one wrong note could cost your life. But even if you do everything right, you could still be unlucky. The king's bed sometimes collapses, not from poor craftsmanship, from his weight. In his final years, when he weighed nearly 180 kilograms, the bed had to be reinforced with hidden iron frames. But one rainy night, when Henry rolled over too forcefully, a support beam snapped, and he crushed the lady-in-waiting beside him. She died instantly. The next morning, he only sighed. At least, it wasn't a beheading. You stand there, before the steps leading to the bed. A servant bows, pulls a silk cord, the curtains part. The king's eyes lock onto you, and you understand stepping up means losing your name, your identity, your right to resist. But not stepping up is also a death sentence. And if you think this is the worst place to lie down, wait until you learn what happens behind the curtains when the lights go out and the powerful hand of a man, twice your weight, reaches for you, still believing he's desired. Then you'll understand this bed isn't for sleeping, it's for devouring you. And the bitter truth is, you can't make a sound when you're devoured. No moans, no cries, no words that might make the king feel he's not in complete control. Because in the Tudor court, a woman who makes noise during sex could be seen as lascivious, disrespectful, even heretical. And if the man beside you is Henry VIII, who believes every expression in bed reflects loyalty, every quickened breath could be a reason to be cast out of court by morning. In Tudor society, women were property, breeding tools, trophies. Just as a horse isn't allowed to neigh while pulling a cart, women weren't supposed to moan during sex, especially not when the man above is the king anointed by God. Because if you moan, you're feeling pleasure. If you feel pleasure, you're participating. If you participate, you're no longer fully dominated. And that in Henry's mind is unacceptable. Henry wanted women silent, grateful, and utterly submissive. Every kiss he gave was a privilege. Every touch, a divine ritual. He didn't need a partner. He needed an audience. A silent audience, trembling with awe, not panic. There were nights, whispered by ladies-in-waiting, when a woman's soft laugh after the king completed his duty made him stand, throw the blanket in her face, and order guards to take her away. She was never seen again. Outside the court, the prejudice was even harsher. Women had no right to desire. The ideal wife endured marital duties like a saint, enduring sacrifice, eyes closed, mouth shut, hands on her stomach as if praying. Even marriage manuals of the time summed up women's roles in a few lines. Obey your husband, never let him doubt your heart, and never show anything that makes him lose control. And yet, Henry VIII was a deeply complex man. He wanted you silent, but also happy. He wanted to feel he pleased you, but if you were too pleased, he'd suspect you'd had prior experience. He wanted to see satisfaction, but only to the degree he allowed. Get it? It's a psychological game with no rules, where every expression could be a reason for condemnation. Worse, you couldn't pretend too poorly. A blank stare, a tight-lipped mouth, a rigid body, all could ignite his fury. You act like I'm a rapist, he once roared at a young lady-in-waiting, who only closed her eyes and held her breath all night. She wasn't killed, but was sent to the kitchens to pick through garbage. A punishment worse than death, because it showed you're not worthy of the king's bed. Henry didn't need a woman. He needed a mirror to reflect his grandeur, strength, and pride. And that mirror had to reflect the right shade. Just enough delight, just enough fear, just enough awareness that you're lying beside a superior being. You had to smile, but with admiration, not mockery. You had to pant, but as if overwhelmed by divinity, not exhaustion. And absolutely no moaning, unless it's a moan like you're ascending to heaven, where you know the king always has a front row seat. In his final years, as Henry grew heavy and irritable, his obsession with women's silence grew fiercer. Ladies-in-waiting were taught that if summoned to the king's room, they must master 3 levels of silence. Silent when entering, silent when touched, silent when leaving. Anyone who broke this, even accidentally, was listed as lacking virtue. And virtue, in Henry's eyes, wasn't about who you were. It was about whether you could keep your mouth shut. There's a story passed among chambermaids. Once during intimacy, a girl let slip, "Oh God," just 3 words. Henry stopped, panting, eyes blazing. "God? Why mention God now?" he shouted. That night, she was forced to confess, not for invoking God, but for daring to make a sound while under the king, because any sound, no matter what, meant you still had the capacity to resist. And a woman resisting, in Tudor times, was disrespectful. A woman resisting in the king's bed was treason. So when you climb into bed, lie beside him. When his ring-laden hand slides into your hair and his breath floods your neck, you must lock every sound inside. You must suppress every breath, every swallow. You must learn to be silent with loyalty. Because here, silence isn't just golden. Silence is survival. And in the Tudor court, only the living get summoned again. But remember, no matter how silent you are, no matter how perfectly you pretend, if Henry is displeased, you could still be erased from this world, as if you never existed. Because power lies in his hands, and truth lies beneath his sheets. And if you think pretending to enjoy in silence is the worst part, wait until you learn why so many women who lay in the king's bed chose never to speak again. It's not that they no longer had tongues, but that they no longer had a reason to use them. They had learned a costly lesson in the Tudor court. Silence didn't just save lives, it preserved what little was left of their dignity. But no one understood this lesson more deeply than Catherine of Aragon, the first woman, the first official wife, and the one Henry VIII turned into a stepping stone for the chaotic sexual, political, and religious life that followed. 23 years as the king's wife. 23 years lying beside a man who believed love was possession and desire was a blood tax. Women paid for his pity, and in all that time, Catherine never had a single night of true pleasure. Not because she didn't love Henry, but because Henry never truly loved anyone. Catherine came to England as a chess piece, a princess of Aragon, daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella, the most powerful Catholic monarchs of Spain. She was married to Prince Arthur, Henry's older brother, at 16. Arthur died less than a year later, and Henry, then only 10, became the heir, and was betrothed to his brother's widow, a marriage arranged by the Pope, Parliament, and God. But no one asked Catherine if she wanted it, just as later, no one asked if she wanted Henry in her bed. In his youth, Henry was infatuated with Catherine, perhaps because she was the noblest prize he could claim, an educated, intelligent, reserved woman, and above all, pure. The trouble began when the early years of marriage produced no son. Catherine was pregnant at least 6 times, 5 ended in miscarriage or stillbirth. Only Mary, their daughter, survived, and for Henry, that was an unforgivable disgrace. A man like him, a superior being like him, couldn't possibly fail to produce a prince. If it wasn't his fault, it had to be hers. That's when everything crumbled. From a favored wife, Catherine became a thorn in Henry's side. In bed he grew cold, then rough, then stopped touching her altogether. In court, he still called her queen, but behind the bedroom door, he treated her like an old blanket used too long. Catherine, meanwhile, still loved him. She prayed daily, asking God to make her husband wiser and kinder, and she still went to his bed when summoned, lying still like it was a ritual. No moans, no smiles, no tears. She knew the rules. She didn't dare break them. The truth is, in all her 23 years as Henry's wife, no one ever mentioned Catherine's physical pleasure. No letter, no diary, no whisper suggested she was ever satisfied. Only one note from a maid. She often left the king's room at dawn, her eyes not red, but not sparkling either. A kind of sorrow drained dry, a permanent resignation. And then when Anne Boleyn appeared, younger, sharper, better at playing the game of sexual hide-and-seek, Catherine was left behind. Not banished, not publicly shamed, just invisible. She was no longer summoned to his room, no longer held hands in public, no longer seen as the one meant to sit beside the throne. Henry wanted a divorce, but the Pope wouldn't allow it. And because Catherine was a Catholic princess, the divorce wasn't just about love, it was a religious war. But Henry wasn't one to wait. He created the Church of England, cut ties with the Vatican, declared himself the sole authority to divorce and remarry. And so Catherine, from queen, became the widow of Prince Arthur. Her title tied her to her first husband, a corpse, a way to say, "You were never truly my wife." In her final years, Catherine was sent to live in a remote castle, forbidden from seeing her daughter, entering court, or attending church. She died alone, with no one by her side. Henry didn't attend her funeral, didn't send flowers, didn't mourn. Some say that on the day Catherine died, Henry was hunting, and when told the news, he merely shrugged, "God will judge," then turned back to chasing a white stag in the forest. A perfect image for a man who never paused long enough to see what he'd done. But there's one thing he never knew, or refused to admit. Catherine was the only one who truly loved him for who he was, not for his crown. She didn't scheme, didn't seduce, didn't climb for power. She just loved, in the way a Catholic woman believed was sacred, loyal, devoted, and silent. And you, caught in the whirlwind of desire and power, should remember this. If even someone like Catherine was discarded after 2 decades of submission, what's left for you? A name absent from history after a single night beside the king. If you think Catherine was the only tragedy, wait until you hear what happened to the next woman, one not just unloved but loved so fiercely. She lost her head for it. Anne Boleyn didn't die for betrayal. She died for a greater sin, making the king feel he'd loved the wrong person. But before her head fell, before everything turned to blood and curses, England's court entered a global crisis, all because the most powerful man in the land wasn't allowed to sleep with the woman he wanted. And when the Pope said no, Henry VIII didn't kneel and beg. He tore the Christian world in two. Many have asked what made Henry VIII willing to break England from the Vatican. Patriotism, political conflict, reformist ideals. No, the truth is far cruder and more bitter. He wanted to marry Anne Boleyn, and to do that he needed to divorce Catherine. But Pope Clement V refused. And why? Because Catherine was the niece of Emperor Charles V, ruler of the Holy Roman Empire. Approving the divorce would anger Charles. Angering Charles was like signing a death warrant for the Holy See. Henry didn't care. He was king. He was a man. He couldn't endure another day beside someone who didn't make him feel like a man. He wanted Anne, young, sharp, different. Anne wouldn't sleep with him before marriage. She drove him mad with desire. Henry wrote her over 20 letters, some so explicit they could pass for texts from a modern-day obsessive. "I think of you every night. I count the days until I'm between your legs." Not my invention. That's the politest translation of the original. And to have her, he needed the Pope's nod. But the Pope didn't nod. The Vatican stood firm, and for Henry, that was a slap to his royal ego. How could a man who ruled a nation not choose who to sleep with? Why should he kneel to an Italian cleric when he was crowned by God? In his rage, an idea sparked. If God wasn't on his side, he'd make God stand with him and replace his representative in England. So Henry did the unthinkable. He founded the Church of England, declared himself its supreme head, stripped the Pope's authority, and with that, he got his divorce. Married Anne, slept with her with his own approval. But the cost of this legal undressing was steep. England shook. Monasteries were dissolved. Dissenting priests were hanged, disemboweled, torn apart. Thousands of citizens were executed for daring to say the Pope is still God's voice. Blood flowed from courts to churches, and amid those pools of blood, Henry sat calmly, holding Anne's hand, smiling as if he'd won a great victory. But that victory began with something very small. He couldn't stand being denied sex. Anne Boleyn, though, wasn't the one in control. She thought she was loved. She didn't realize that once Henry tore apart a religious system for a woman, she couldn't afford to disappoint him. But Anne didn't produce a son. She only gave birth to Elizabeth, later the great Elizabeth I. But then just a girl who fueled Henry's anger. And so the cycle repeated. Coldness, distance, suspicion, then accusations. Anne's death was an extension of the Reformation. If he could end ties with God to marry her, he could end her to marry another. Anne was charged with incest, adultery, treason, without evidence. All it took was the king saying, "She hurt me." That was enough for the sword to fall. You see it now. Henry didn't just want the right to love. He wanted the right to discard anyone who no longer excited him.
Yay.
And to do that, he was willing to break the very system that raised him. In Henry's hands, sex wasn't private. It was a lever to control history. And in the darkest nights at Hampton Court, No one could tell where doctrine ended and debauchery began, because it all stemmed from a simple question: why can't I sleep with her? And you, summoned, trembling in the palace corridors, realizing your body could make the king rewrite doctrine, you should tread carefully, because if you make him feel denied, you won't just anger him, you could shift history's course, and your head will be the price for that turn. If you think Anne Boleyn was the peak of his religious sexual obsession, wait until you meet the next woman, the one who gave Henry what he craved most, then died before she could see him truly happy. But to reach her, Jane Seymour, Henry had to wade through a year-long frenzy named Anne Boleyn. No one ever tested the king's patience like her. No one made Henry VIII, who could behead anyone who didn't please him, wait 18 months to touch a woman's body. And no one ever made him love, rage and fear, as Anne did. Anne Boleyn wasn't classically beautiful. She didn't have Catherine's ivory skin, or the curvaceous figure of French nobility, but she had something every other lady-in-waiting lacked: willpower and the skill to control another's desire. Anne, daughter of a mid-tier noble family, was sent to France early, steeped in a mix of courtly manners and seductive artistry. She knew how to walk a half-step slower, tilt her face at the perfect angle, offer a fleeting smile, then vanish like mist. To men she was a dream just out of reach. To Henry, she was something he didn't own, and thus, he had to have her. When the king took notice, Anne didn't act like other women, who knelt, trembled, or obeyed at the first flirtation. Anne did the opposite. She refused, not boldly, not rudely, but calculatedly. "I cannot be your majesty's mistress. It would kill my honor." That sentence stabbed Henry's pride like a velvet-wrapped dagger. And he, who held the church in his hand, who beheaded a wife for not bearing a son, began a humiliating, restless wait, like a lovesick youth. He wrote letters, sent gifts, penned love poems, granted lands, titles to her family. And in return, Anne kept refusing, not to play hard to get, but to stretch her path to power. She knew that sleeping with Henry before marriage would end like those before her, discarded. She understood her body was a weapon, but only if it remained sealed, and Henry went mad for that seal. The whole court knew. Catherine, still the official queen, watched in pain as her husband openly pined for another woman. Nobles whispered about the king staying up every night, the king writing letters all morning, like a lovesick poet, until one day, Henry declared an irreversible decision: "I will divorce Catherine and marry Anne." No one believed it, not because they doubted his feelings for Anne, but because no one thought a woman could make a king change religion, rewrite laws, behead people, and reshape history just to unlace her corset. Finally, after 18 months of waiting, after a religious and political revolution, Henry and Anne married, and he finally got her in bed. No one knows what that wedding night was like. No one dared ask. But rumors say that the next morning, Henry emerged with a terrifyingly radiant look, as if he'd finally proven to God himself that he was worthy. Anne, silent, gave a faint smile, and from that day began wearing white fox fur, the color of queenly power. But the problem with waiting so long for something is it never matches the fantasy. Anne didn't produce a son. Her first pregnancy ended in miscarriage. Her second bore Elizabeth, a girl. Henry was disappointed. She was disappointed. And in that disappointment, cracks appeared. Henry began to suspect she hadn't kept the purity he believed in. He started questioning, if she dared refuse me for 18 months, does that mean she's not fully submissive? And if not fully submissive, then dangerous. Anne, to hold power, began meddling in politics. She influenced appointments, picked courtiers, spoke bluntly about Henry's bad decisions that made him feel weaker. He'd waited for her like a lovesick fool. Now he feared she controlled him. And like every powerful man hurt by pride, Henry did the cruelest thing. He destroyed what he once loved. Anne was arrested, charged with adultery, incest, treason. Her lovers were tortured into false confessions. No evidence, no law, just the king's words. "She no longer makes me believe in her." That was enough. Anne was beheaded in a quiet, sparsely attended execution. Almost no one came to watch. She wore grey, didn't cry. Before dying, she said, "I die for following my heart." But Henry's heart had long gone cold. You, being led through the corridors where Anne's shadow once passed, should remember one thing: sometimes, making a powerful man love you is dangerous. but making him feel challenged is even worse. Henry never forgave the feeling of weakness in his heart, and the woman who made him wait ended up making him rage for having waited so long. If you think waiting 18 months was the tragedy, wait until you meet the next woman, who in one night with the king gave birth to the dynasty's most desired child, and paid for it with her life. Because in Henry VIII's reign, even a wedding night, the most private, sacred moment of a person's life, could become evidence of treason, not because you did anything wrong, but because you made the king feel deceived. And nothing enraged Henry VIII more than feeling deceived in his own bed. Anne Boleyn's story didn't end when the sword fell. It ended earlier, on the night Henry finally touched the woman he'd waited 18 months for, with all the hunger of instinct, ego, and masculine pride. But what happened in that bedroom didn't match the script he'd built for over a year. No overwhelming passion, no absolute submission, and crucially, no son born afterward. In Henry's mind, that was betrayal. Rumors spread right after the wedding night that Anne wasn't a virgin, that she was too skilled, too forward, too familiar with intimacy. A noble close to Henry even whispered to him, "Sire, a woman who's never lain with a man couldn't do such things." That sentence, though never officially recorded, took root in the mind of a man obsessed with being cuckolded and terrified he wasn't the first. From then on, Henry saw everything through suspicion. Anne's glances at courtiers, brief hallway conversations, whispers from court musicians. He no longer saw a wife, but a growing rebellion in his bed. A woman who not only dared refuse him before marriage, but now dared shame him in their sheets. So, he ordered surveillance. Not with guards, but with ears behind curtains, eyes behind red velvet. Anne's maids were interrogated. Her lute player was jailed for disrespectful demeanor. Letters between ladies and nobles were torn open, scrutinized word by word. And then one day, Henry declared his wife had cheated, not once but many times, not with one man but with her brother, courtiers, a harpist. Anne was arrested, not because of evidence, because in Henry's mind, the feeling of betrayal had become absolute truth, the feeling that he'd lost face on their first night together, and from that, everything else grew like vines around a wounded core. They called it a political trial, a court purge. But the truth is, it all began with a night beside each other, where Henry didn't feel like the victor. And when a king no longer feels victorious in bed, he wins by turning the bed into a courtroom. Anne was convicted of treason, adultery, incest. A long list of lovers was drawn up, most never even in her room. They were tortured, forced to confess whatever the court wanted. All defenses were ignored, all alibis shredded. Because the real evidence for Henry was that first night, the night he felt he wasn't the first. And so he needed no law, no justice. He needed to wash away the insult with blood. Anne stepped onto the scaffold, gaunt, pale, hands trembling but tearless. She knew she wasn't dying for being a traitor. She died for making a powerful man feel weak, even for a moment. You're hearing this from the corridor outside the king's bedroom. You're waiting your turn to be called in. You tremble, not just from fear, but because you understand every night with Henry isn't an act of love, it's a test. And if you make him feel small, awkward, or defeated, even once, your body ceases to be flesh. It becomes evidence to convict you, to justify his rage, to prove that the fault is yours, not mine. If you think that's the final limit of madness, wait until you meet Jane Seymour, who in one wedding night gave birth to what the kingdom longed for, a son, and then vanished forever before tasting anything resembling happiness. Because in Henry VIII's world, if you're a woman, happiness isn't a reward, it's a trap. And no one fell into that trap more tragically or swiftly than Jane Seymour, the woman England hailed as an angel. But to Henry, she was merely a biological gateway to his ultimate goal, a son. Jane gave him that, then died, quietly, cleanly, and so conveniently. It was almost perfect. If Anne Boleyn was fire, Jane Seymour was cool water. Everything about her was gentle, calm, and without sharp edges. Jane didn't fight, didn't provoke, didn't seduce with glances or poetry. She was humble, silent, and knew her place, three qualities that, after the chaos with Anne, made Henry feel safe, like stepping from a storm into a windless room. Henry met Jane while Anne was pregnant with her last child. She was a lady-in-waiting, unremarkable, but perfectly timed. When the king needed someone to make him believe women could still be agreeable, obedient, and above all, capable of bearing a son. There was no long wait, like with Anne, no dramatic infatuation. Everything with Jane was simple, smooth, and scripted by Henry. Divorce, marry, consummate. The wedding night left no legends, no fiery descriptions, just a cold fact: she conceived almost immediately. And when that happened, the kingdom held its breath. If Jane bore a prince, she'd be worshipped as a goddess. If not, she'd become another name, cast into shadow. In October 1537, Jane gave birth to Edward VI, the first prince after 2 wives, and countless disappointments. Henry went wild with joy. He threw lavish feasts, gave alms to the poor, even embraced courtiers he'd once threatened to behead. In that moment, he thought he'd won it all: God, fate, and himself. Jane, who delivered that victory, was hailed as the perfect queen. But then she bled uncontrollably. After childbirth, Jane showed signs of infection. For 12 days she fought between life and death, while Henry avoided her room, visiting briefly, then leaving, as if her death was a quiet footnote to a completed task. She died on October 24th, when Edward was barely 2 weeks old. Henry mourned Jane, but his mourning was like grieving a prize steed that died after a glorious race. He ordered a grand funeral, raised a memorial statue, and swore never to marry another in his heart, a vow that didn't stop him from marrying 3 more women. But one promise he kept. When he died, he asked to be buried beside Jane, not because he loved her most, but because she was the only one who didn't disappoint him. You might think Jane was the winner. She wasn't executed, wasn't abandoned, wasn't slandered. But look deeper, and you'll see, she never had the chance to be anything beyond a fortunate womb. She had no time to rule, to love, to err, to fail. She came as a solution, and left as a function fulfilled. And you, preparing to climb into the king's bed, should understand this. Sometimes surviving a night isn't the hardest part. The hardest is surviving when you've done everything right, and still have no say in your fate. Jane Seymour gave the kingdom what it awaited, but her reward was nothing more than a death wrapped in a few lines of history. If you think bearing a son makes you untouchable, wait until you meet the next woman. The one who didn't need a wedding night, didn't need to bear a child, didn't even need to be beautiful. The one who through a single portrait made Henry rush to marry, only to declare the next morning he'd been deceived, and demand a return. Because in all the romantic tragedies of Henry VIII, none are as bizarre, ironic, and cruel as the story of Anne of Cleves, the woman who did nothing wrong except show up with the wrong face. A marriage arranged from afar, a portrait painted too skillfully, and a king expecting honey in his eyes, until the woman walked in and instantly killed his desire. After Jane Seymour's death, Henry needed a new alliance. Europe was in turmoil. The Pope was furious over Henry's breakaway church, and Catholic powers were whispering plots to topple England. The diplomatic solution? A political marriage with a princess from Cleves, a Protestant strategic region, far from the Vatican and close to Germany. Anne of Cleves was the ideal choice. Noble, proper, untainted by scandal, and reportedly robustly beautiful and refined. A portrait, painted by the renowned Hans Holbein, depicted a woman with a gentle face, smooth white skin, and soft eyes. Henry saw it and was smitten. He decided to marry her. The problem was, the painting couldn't speak, and when Anne of Cleves set foot in England, stepping off the ship, Henry couldn't contain his curiosity. He disguised himself as a commoner and rushed to see his new love in an unguarded moment, a romantic trick he'd used with past lovers. But this time, what happened was, he saw her, froze for a few seconds, then turned away with a face like he'd been punched in the gut. A courtier's diary noted, His Majesty returned pale, saying he'd been blatantly deceived. She wasn't ugly, but she didn't match the portrait. Worse, she didn't fit Henry's familiar mold of femininity. Anne didn't speak fluent English, didn't know how to dance, couldn't sing, and lacked the finesse to read the power dynamics in a room. She ate heartily, laughed too loudly, and worst of all, didn't make Henry feel like a man. Asterisk. At their first private meeting, he awkwardly kissed her hand, sniffed her hair, then muttered to a courtier, "I cannot perform my manly duties with this one." But everything was already arranged. All of Europe knew about the wedding. It couldn't be cancelled. So the wedding night happened, begrudgingly and miserably. as if the king were being dragged to the gallows. The next morning, Henry emerged with a horrified face and said a now historic line, "She is still intact, and so am I," meaning nothing happened. A wedding night with no touching, no undressing, no sighs. What makes the story even more bitter is Anne didn't understand. She thought she was doing everything right. She smiled, tried to make conversation, tried to fit in. Meanwhile, the court buzzed, courtiers betting on how long the marriage would last. And as predicted, just weeks later, Henry declared, "I cannot live with this woman." He demanded a divorce, but not on grounds of dislike. He claimed the marriage was unconsummated. "I was misled about her beauty, and God did not bless the union." Anne was sent away from court, but strangely, not executed, not publicly shamed, not vilified. Why? Because she agreed to the divorce, didn't protest, didn't make a fuss, and even blessed Henry's future marriages. A submissive gesture, exactly what Henry loved, too late. And so, she was granted the title King's Sister, living in luxury with lands and money, never having to lie beside anyone at night. A failure in bed, but the only woman to leave the king with her head, name and a peaceful life intact. And Henry? He returned to his hunger. The hunger for women, for being desired, lusted after, satisfied like a god of fertility. The failure with Anne made him even more obsessed. How could a king fail to rise for a woman? Was he old? Was he cursed? To erase that shame, he had to find a new girl, young, slender, flirtatious, and ready to make him believe he was still capable. You about to be summoned to the king's bed. Remember this. Sometimes, being too harmless is something the king can't tolerate. Henry didn't need someone who matched a portrait. He needed someone to make him believe he wasn't finished. And if you fail, not for any specific sin, but because you don't make him feel heroic, you might be divorced, or buried, depending on how offended the king's eyes are the next morning. If you think being returned like faulty goods is the worst, wait until you meet the next woman, the one who ignited Henry's final flame of desire and lost her head when it went out. Because when you're Catherine Howard, 19 years old, youthful, soft, smelling of summer pollen, and stepping into the bed of a man 3 decades older, twice your size, who's beheaded wives for failing to make him feel like a king, you don't realize every moan, every breath, every clumsy whisper will become evidence. Not evidence of love, evidence of betrayal. In the Tudor palace, betrayal doesn't need guns or knives. It only needs a whisper to the king, and you lose your head. Catherine Howard entered Henry's life like a hot breeze in a storm of instinctual exhaustion. After the failure with Anne of Cleves, whom he couldn't touch, Henry was sinking into self-doubt. He needed affirmation, proof that his body still mattered, that he wasn't old, not useless. And then Catherine appeared, a niece of the Duke of Norfolk, raised as a decorative flower for the court, not too clever, not too cunning, but with one thing no prior wife still had, a gaze of fearful admiration. Henry was captivated at first sight. She shrugged shyly, smiled with pursed lips, eyes wide like a fawn. To him, now swollen, festering, each step a lingering pain from his ulcerated leg, Catherine was the final illusion of youth. And like every man fearing he's lost the ability to love, Henry loved her like a fever, frantic, chaotic, urgent. He married her mere months after meeting, ignoring clerics, skipping background checks. She entered the king's bedroom with pear-scented hair, and the belief that as long as she was obedient, charming, and pleasing, she'd live safely. The problem was, Catherine had known men before becoming the king's wife, and worse, she continued to, after becoming his wife. At first, her soft moans, her whispered Thomas in dreams, only made maids giggle. But then, those sounds were heard, recorded, reported, turned into letters of accusation. In the Tudor palace, walls had ears, sheets had listeners, and every sound you thought private would be repeated, word for word. It said Catherine once moaned her former lover's name while sleeping beside the king. Another time, she was caught secretly sending gifts and handwritten notes to Thomas Culpeper, a young, handsome courtier who wasn't the king. The truth is, Catherine wasn't cunning. She was too naive to realize she was lying beside a human trap. She thought love was real. She thought she was young enough to be both the king's wife and whisper to an old flame. She didn't understand that every glance, every bath lasting over 15 minutes, every time she left a room with flushed cheeks, would be read as a crime. And then the rumors reached Henry. At first, he didn't believe them. Not because he thought Catherine was innocent, but because he didn't want to believe he was a fool again. But evidence piled up. Testimonies from maids, guards, the key holder to her room, a love letter, an embroidered handkerchief. Henry roared, again. Was I born to be betrayed forever? And then, like a vengeful whirlwind, he ordered Catherine's arrest. No meeting, no explanation, no final look at the king. They say, while imprisoned, Catherine screamed and cried for 3 nights, begged to see the king, pleaded for a chance to explain, but no one answered. Henry locked himself in his room, refusing food, speaking to no one, lying panting, clutching his festering leg, moaning as if he were the victim of a violated pride. Catherine was executed on a cold February morning, the wind cutting skin like tiny knives. Before being bound, she asked a question that froze the guards. Can I place my head on the block and practice once, to get it right? A 19-year-old girl, once called the Pearl of the Crown, now a head lying silent on a cold wooden block. You, freshly prepared and summoned to the palace, remember this, in the king's bedroom, there is no past, and there can be no secrets. Every breath you think is instinct will be heard. Every name you accidentally call out will be written down as treason. You're not lying with a man, you're lying with a machine of gossip, power, and deadly suspicion. If you think Catherine was the last victim of a lust disguised as a throne, wait until you meet the final woman who walked through all of Henry's bloody past and survived. Not because she loved better, but because she knew when to stay silent and placed her faith in God, not men. Because if there's one thing that helps you survive Henry VIII's bedroom, it's not beauty, not sweet moans, not even pleasing skills, but the cold intelligence of someone who knows lying beside the king is lying beside death, and every night survived is a miracle. And that miracle's name is Catherine Parr, the 6th wife, the last, the only one not beheaded, not divorced, not dead from childbirth, the woman who walked through Henry's marital battlefield and came out whole. When Catherine Parr met Henry, she was over 30, twice widowed, no longer young, no longer a virgin, and done with marriage. She was in love with another, Thomas Seymour, Jane Seymour's brother, a gentle, stable love built on letters, understanding, and mutual respect. But when the king noticed her, all personal plans collapsed. Henry by then was swollen, his leg rotting, often screaming in pain at night, as if possessed. He needed a nurse, a comforter, a warm hand on his forehead at midnight. Catherine Parr wasn't chosen as a lover. She was appointed as the king's moral physician and spiritual caretaker. At first she resisted. She begged to leave court. But when she realized refusal in this kingdom meant disappearance, she accepted. And from that moment, she began a survival game, unlike any before. She didn't try to make Henry love her. She made him feel cared for. She didn't try to seduce. She made him feel understood. She didn't get jealous, didn't sulk, didn't meddle in plots. She stayed silent, read scriptures, studied theology, and let Henry believe, this is the only woman who wants nothing from me, but to pray for my soul. Catherine Parr was educated, fluent in Latin and Greek, and even wrote books. She debated with clerics, voiced progressive theological views, convinced Henry to print books in English instead of Latin, defying the Vatican, a dangerous move at the time. If mishandled, she could be branded a heretic, and indeed, Catholic factions in court schemed to send her to the stake. They showed Henry her writings, claiming she was misinterpreting theology, distorting God's will. Henry, as usual, raged. But Catherine Parr wasn't Anne Boleyn to argue, nor Catherine Howard to cry. She knelt, kissed the king's hand, said everything she wrote was to entertain him, ease his pain, and if anything was wrong, it was the fault of her shallow female mind. A perfect performance, not to defend honor, but to save her head. And it worked. Henry withdrew the arrest order. Her enemies were silenced. Catherine kept living, not gloriously, but alive. They say in his final years, when Henry could barely walk, Catherine was the only one who dared touch him without wincing. She changed his bandages, fed him porridge, read to him, cleaned his festering leg, and never showed a hint of disgust or pity. Not because she loved him, but because she accepted that to survive in the Tudor palace, you couldn't love, you had to endure better than others. Henry died in 1547. Catherine didn't cry. She wore black, stepped back 3 paces as his coffin passed, then retreated to live quietly in the countryside. 6 months later, she married her old love, Thomas Seymour. A simple wedding, no court, no politics. But fate wasn't done. She conceived late, suffered complications, and died in childbirth, leaving an orphaned baby girl weeks later. Catherine Parr was the last wife, but not the happiest. She simply outlived the others, and knew when to bow her head. You, tiptoeing into the dim room reeking of royal pus and sweat, should remember, in Henry VIII's bed, to love is to die, to cry out is to die, and to be smart and show it is to die. Survival isn't about being loved, it's about knowing when to stay silent, when to seem weak, and when to hold Henry's hand while keeping a dagger behind your back for self-defense. If you think this is the end of a bloody chain of marriages, you're wrong, because Henry VIII's sexual life was only part of his power frenzy. What's more terrifying is what he left behind: a fractured kingdom, a religion split in two, and a sexual legacy wrapped in scripture. But of all that Henry VIII left behind, a private church, 3 beheaded queens, a court of vipers in wigs, the most haunting lies not in records, but in the bedroom, specifically on his colossal body, because in his final years, Henry was no longer a king. He was a moving hill, a mountain of flesh rising amid the palace, so heavy they needed pulleys to hoist him onto his bed. It sounds funny, but no one laughed, because that scene, like something from a bad comedy, was the final tragedy of a man who believed he was God's embodiment. In his youth, Henry had an athletic build, toned, riding horses tirelessly, shooting arrows like a god, playing tennis better than any noble. But after 40, it all collapsed, fast, as if the heavens cursed his left leg. A jousting wound, sustained in the nightly sport of charging with lances, never healed. It infected, ulcerated, festered, and Henry began to bloat, not charmingly plump, bloated to where he couldn't dress himself, bloated to where each meal consumed enough food to feed 10 guards, and most crucially, bloated to where a custom pulley system was built to lift him from floor to bed, a bed reinforced with steel, because wooden legs couldn't bear his weight anymore. Courtiers were tasked with pulling the ropes, like hoisting a cannon onto a fortress, except this cannon growled, sweated, and snapped if jostled too hard. They had to pull quickly, evenly, and never let the ropes jam, because when Henry was left dangling mid-air, his groans echoed down the corridors, followed by curses that made guards at the gate blush. In bed, things weren't better. Henry needed at least 3 people to turn him, 2 to lift his belly, 1 to bend his knees. Every time he wanted intimacy, it was a strategic event planned from the afternoon. Check the pulley ropes, change the sheets, place sweat-absorbing cloths in 3 spots, prepare fragrant oils to mask the stench of pus from his leg. The woman summoned was less a lover, more a night shift nurse. And if Henry felt an itch he couldn't reach, you had to scratch it and smile. Worse, Henry's greatest obsession wasn't his body, it was whether he could still raise the flag. A man once hailed as Europe's royal sex machine now sat amid pillows, cheeks puffed with rage, asking courtiers, "Can a gentleman who cannot perform still be a gentleman?" No one answered, but everyone knew, every failure in bed meant someone lost their head, and in a cruel irony, the fatter, sicker, more impotent he grew, Henry demanded younger, lighter, more performative girls. Nobles competed to offer nieces, daughters, cousins, anyone beautiful and mute, not truly mute, but knowing when to stay silent, moan at the right moment, act shocked at his touch, and feign fainting from the honor of being called, all to convince Henry he was still a man, but the flesh spilling over his sides didn't hide the potency of royal manhood. That if he needed 2 men to lift his leg for sex, it wasn't because he was impotent, but because he was too grand to do it alone. You, being led through the cold corridor to the bedroom with pulley ropes hanging from the wooden ceiling, should understand in minutes, you're not just climbing into bed with a man, you're scaling a mountain, unsure if you'll survive the descent. You must smile as you're pulled close to a 180-kilogram body, You must act overwhelmed by the wheezing breaths, the heaving belly like a blacksmith's forge, and the metallic breath of a man who's drunk blood and wine most of his life. And most crucially, you must make him believe you're not afraid, because fear is an insult, and an insult is far easier to handle than disappointing him. If you think waiting for the king to be hoisted onto the bed is the worst part, wait until you realize, once he's up there, you must make him forget he needed ropes to climb. You must make him believe he's still young Henry, while you lie beside a mass of flesh slowly rotting. And if, despite your perfect caresses, your rehearsed holy flattery, he still can't rise, may God help you, because that failure isn't just biological. To Henry VIII, it's a national disgrace, a collapse of the delusional empire, where he's the center of the sexual universe. And every time his body disobeys, Henry doesn't bow in shame, he rages as if his territory's been invaded. That rage isn't like normal anger. It's not mere shouting or smashing things. It's a ceremonial catastrophe, a tempest sweeping through Hampton Court's walls, making guards' hearts stop and maids go mute for 3 days. One failure to rise, and at least 5 people lose their posts. 2 are banished from court. 1 disappears forever, body unfound, because Henry couldn't bear the thought that the fault was his. It had to be someone else's. Maybe the servants arranged the meal wrong, causing his stomach to vent at the wrong frequency. Maybe the mattress sank on one side, misdirecting blood flow. But most often, the reason was women. She wasn't attractive enough. She looked at me like a father. She smelled strange. Any excuse. As long as it wasn't, my body is ruined. You're lying in bed, cold sweat down your back, hand still on the king's flabby, hairy arm, trying to keep your lips curved in a half-admiring, half-soothing smile. You know if you say, "It's fine, your majesty," he'll roar. Silence. If you try to kiss again, he'll push you away. Don't pity me. If you just look at him, your gaze accidentally landing on the heaving, impotent belly, you could die for insulting royalty. So you do the only thing that might save you. You blame yourself. Your servant was too foolish to lie beside a god. Surely my lowliness kept your majesty's body from responding. Please forgive my unworthy presence. You're not reciting poetry. You're begging to live. The problem is, Henry doesn't hear with his ears. He hears with the humiliated screams in his chest. A rage with no outlet, no place to vent, no one bold enough to speak the truth. And so it becomes a national fury, where he issues absurd decrees, kills loyal courtiers, orders bishops to pray all night for England's cursed soul, all because he couldn't rise once. And worse, he remembers every time. He records it. Some nights, he sat by the fireplace, face flushed, hand gripping a wine goblet, muttering the names of women who made him feel small. Those names later appeared in secret trials. Some were charged with heresy, some accused of adultery from before they entered court, some simply erased, struck from all records, as if they never existed. You, sitting still in sweat-soaked sheets, reeking of medicinal pus, know this. Tonight, if he doesn't succeed, tomorrow you're no longer a name. You're a disaster, a living proof of the failure he can't bear. And to survive, you must turn his impotence into deliberate choice. Perhaps your majesty wished to dedicate tonight to sacred rest. Your servant is too unworthy for your divine body, so please forgive my boldness. You turn failure into noble intent. You turn last-minute silence into a ritual of saintly self-control. Only then might Henry spare you.
Not because he believes you,
but because he needs a lie soft enough to sleep on. And tomorrow, if he still remembers your name, you might live. If not, flee the palace as fast as you can, before he sees your portrait on the wall and recalls, "I couldn't do anything with her." But if you think Henry VIII surrendered to impotence, you don't yet understand the nature of a man who believed he was God's whip in a bloated mortal shell. He refused to accept his body was broken, refused to accept that his penis, the political weapon that carried him through 6 wives, was now a living archaeological relic. And when the grandest part of him no longer rose on command, Henry didn't pray, didn't meditate, didn't accept. He drank, he smeared, he steamed, he injected. Anything to revive what lay below his navel, from thick honey to toad venom. In Tudor times, sexual medicine was a realm of half superstition, half torture. And for Henry, Every remedy was worth trying, as long as it could resurrect that fallen tower. Physicians, witches, court doctors competed to offer love potions, concocted with recipes that would knot your stomach just hearing them. Honey boiled with dried tiger testicles, ground asparagus, mixed with whale oil, bird's nest soaked in wine, and baked like a biscuit, and the specialty toad venom extract, taken from the poison glands behind a forest toad's neck, boiled down to a tar-like sludge, then blended with opium and crushed gold. Yes, Henry drank gold, because the physicians said only precious metal can awaken royal blood. He swallowed the mixture every morning, face puckered like he'd licked coarse cloth, sweating like a malaria patient, heart pounding like war drums. Once, after a dose of toad venom, he started talking to his shadow in the mirror. But by night, if there was the slightest twitch in that massive belly padding, he declared the medicine effective and ordered an increased dose. Beyond drinking, there was smearing. His back was once coated with wild stallion salve, boiled from the spine of an unmated male horse. They rubbed it on his shoulders, back, inner thighs, then pounded it in with a wooden mallet, like beating a war drum. If he groaned in pain, it was a good sign. The inner energy is flowing. If he didn't groan, the pounder was replaced with someone stronger-handed. Once, they ground dried shark head with arsenic and smeared it on his groin, paired with ancient Latin chants, as if his penis were a soul to be summoned from the underworld. You'd ask, why did Henry believe in these things? Because not believing meant admitting he was done, and Henry never admitted that. He always needed something to blame. If not women, not the bed, not the moon's position, then surely it was the wrong medicine. And when the remedies failed, when Henry still lay like a velvet-wrapped log in the royal bed, rage erupted again. This time, it didn't fall on women, it fell on physicians. 3 were banished from court for poisoning the royal spirit. 1 was slandered for misguiding the king's body to drink at the wrong yin-yang hour. Rumor has it a doctor who dared say, "Your Majesty's condition is due to age and weight," was locked in a stone dungeon for 3 days. When released, he no longer spoke. You, lying beside a body, reeking of ambergris mixed with honey, having just watched Henry swallow a firestone of lust, the size of a thumbnail, know that every time the king fails to rise, someone in the palace gets buried. You must pretend to see results, must whisper, "Your Majesty is warming," your servant feels it. You must moan before he touches, arch your back before his command, make him believe one more drop will have him shattering the palace ceiling with a flood of sacred seed, and if he passes out midway, you don't move. Don't call out, don't pull away, you lie still like in a sacrificial rite, waiting for him to wake without remembering clearly, then you're still the woman who took him highest. But if you slip up, you'll be listed among those who ruined the medicine, an unofficial list, but no one named on it ever survived. If you think honey, opium, and toad venom pills are brutal, wait until you learn. After all that, Henry began to think the problem wasn't his body, but a demonic force sealing his royal potency, and he started summoning sorcerers. But before spells, before honey and toad venom, before pulleys hoisting him, or physicians banished for failing to resurrect the emperor, one power never lost its effect on Henry VIII, lust as a political tool. And in the warped world where his body was becoming ruins, as long as the king still breathed, one night beside him could still change a family's fate. Because in the Tudor court, every time you were summoned to the king's bedroom, your entire clan held its breath in silence, not from fear, but from hope. Hope that the next morning, you'd walk out with a slight limp and dazed eyes, but with a discreet wink, "It's done." Because just one staged moan, one well-placed caress, one whispered, "You are the holiest mountain I've ever climbed," could mean your father gets a promotion, your brother a seat in parliament, and your family's fortunes transform. Henry didn't need to love you. He just needed to believe you loved him. And you didn't need to truly love. You just needed to act better than the others. Impoverished noble families understood this best. They didn't teach their daughters to read. They taught them to look at the king like a half-burning miracle. Look into his eyes, but tilt your head to bare your neck. When he passes, breathe lightly, as if fainting from joy. Don't eat much before being called. A full belly slows movements. That was the curriculum of noble mothers, who knew one night with the king was a prayer answered. Plenty succeeded so well they were granted estates. One girl let the king nibble her ear 3 times and moaned in sync with the church bells. The next morning she was named Court Jewel. Her father got land, her mother a fox fur coat, and their family a 5-year tax exemption. But there were also opposites. Rumor says one woman accidentally called Henry father, mid-caress. Her entire family was driven from London within a week. No trial needed. You just invited to tea laced with saffron, the unofficial signal that tonight's your turn. Know this, you're not just climbing into bed with a puss-riddled body. You're signing a contract with your flesh. And if you don't perform well, if you don't make him believe he's still a god's power, your entire clan will pay the price. One night with the king is a gamble. Sometimes you get necklaces, cloaks, lands, sometimes a promise of marriage, but just as often, and not rarely, you're sent back to the countryside. No goodbye, no one daring to say your name again. Henry didn't like those who made him feel unattractive, and since he was old, swollen, in pain, and impotent most of the time, pleasing the king became the ultimate survival skill for women of that era. Not everyone made it. Some trembled too much to undress. Some fainted when Henry started unlacing his boots. Some breathed too hard when touching his festering leg, and were deemed to have insulted the royal body. Those women were never called back, but who cared? There was always another girl, younger, better at timed smiles, accidentally dropping her handkerchief, waiting outside the door. None of it was love. It was a system run on fake breaths, fake moans, fake climaxes, and fake loyalty, but with very real results. Some got houses, some got jewels, some got to survive. If you think sex in the Tudor court was passion, you're wrong. It was an economic political survival ecosystem, where every skin-to-skin touch traded for a title, and every moan could save a life. You, rubbing musk perfume inside your elbows, preparing to enter the bedroom where history has moaned, died, and changed color. You're not just a servant. You're a living financial market, about to be tested by the king's rawest gaze. If you think that's the end of the transaction, wait until you learn. Some families were willing to offer their 13-year-old daughters to the king's bed, just hoping one day he'd try her and grant a promise he never kept. But not everyone got to try. Not everyone had that honor, because behind the officially chosen girls, behind the ladies summoned to the bed like a prize, there was another hidden layer in the Tudor court, where there was no love, no title, no light. There, women weren't lovers. They were living tokens. They were court call girls, a real, unnamed, voiceless profession, existing only for orders. Don't be fooled. They weren't called call girls. No one dared say the word. But everyone in court knew. These were women assigned to sleep with the king when he needed relief, but didn't want to involve queens, consorts, or nobles. They didn't wear silk. They wore clean, coarse cloth. They weren't heavily made up, just lightly touched, to avoid blasphemy. And they were never allowed to speak first. They entered through back doors, escorted by guards, down side corridors, slipped into the king's room via secret passages. They lay on the bed before he arrived, because His Majesty has no time to wait. And when he was done, they left before he opened his eyes. No one recorded them. No one asked their names. No one remembered their faces. Catherine Parr knew. She once passed a corridor at midnight and saw a young girl, no older than 14, trembling outside the king's room, clutching her crumpled dress, eyes swollen from crying. Catherine said nothing, because she knew it wasn't a choice, it was an order, and orders, in the palace, were never questioned. Most of these girls came from low families, daughters of musicians, nieces of stablemen, sisters of guards. They were invited to court, to learn sewing, serve tea, then one day called aside. They didn't dare refuse. They were coached. If the king notices you, smile. If he touches you, don't flinch. If he's displeased, don't show it. And if they did well, a small reward, some coins, new shoes, or a half-year tax break for their father. But if they didn't do well, they vanished. No one spoke of them. No one searched. Just a bed with sheets changed twice the next morning. You sitting in the waiting room, hands shaking, knowing you're called not by name but by a list. Understand, tonight isn't about desire. It's brutal politics wrapped in breath. You're not asked to seduce. You're ordered to submit. You're a sedative, a test dose, a tool to check if he can still do it. If you say something wrong, you'll be labeled insolent. If you don't react strongly enough, you'll be judged for insulting the royal body. And if you leave any trace, blood, tears, even heavy breathing, you'll be accused of deliberately marking the king's memory. You won't get to tell your story. No one will write your record. No one will build you a statue. And absolutely no one will believe you if one day you say, "I was forced." Because in the Tudor court, the king didn't force anyone. He only granted favor. You're just an order in human form. And tomorrow, as you walk through the corridor, leaving the royal bedroom, guards won't look at you. Maids will turn away. You'll return to serving tea, washing cloaks, standing behind curtains at feasts. And no one may mention that night, because that night doesn't exist. It's not recorded. No one witnessed it. No one verifies it. But your body remembers. The choking musk scent. The groan of a man too old to groan but too proud to stay silent. The heavy, slow, angry collision of a decaying body, still forcing its last scraps of power into each breath. And his bleary gaze when he's done, not looking at you like a person, but like a sweat rag after a ceremony. If you think bedding the king is an honor, wait until you see women like you, younger, more obedient, better performers being celebrated, while you're erased. Not because you did anything wrong, but because you did right. But not spectacularly enough to survive. And though no one says it, though the court pretends those nights never happened, one person, only one, recorded everything. Not to blackmail, not to write memoirs, but to preserve the naked, ghastly, cold truth of an empire built on forced moans. That person was the anonymous royal secretary, a shadow always present behind a half-closed door, behind a velvet curtain, behind the servant bringing hot water to the bedroom. No one knew his name, no one saw his face clearly, but everyone heard of him. A rumor, a whisper among maids. Be careful, someone's writing. He was tasked by the king to record the royal intimate activities to preserve court tradition, a fancy way of saying monitor every sexual act of the king, and ensure there's always someone else to blame if it fails. This secretary had a small room next to the king's bedroom, connected by a tiny gap disguised behind a bookshelf. Through it, he heard everything. Breaths, scoldings, the king's curses when he couldn't start, his clapping glee when things worked again. On his desk were 3 template reports: successful night, deferred night, and night requiring investigation of cause. Each night, he filled in the girl's name, start time, end time, the king's condition afterward. You just leaving the bedroom, still wiping sweat, and the king's foot pus from your nightgown. Don't know your name is being inked in black into a brass-locked ledger. Below it, a cold note. Subject responded slowly, failed to use proper flattery, caused king's disinterest at minute 6. And then, in red, do not recall. In those ledgers, hundreds of names were crossed out, not for crimes, but for failing to leave a strong enough impression for the king to remember. Some made him laugh, some brought tears to his eyes, but only those who made him feel like a god got a gold star beside their names. The secretary shared transcripts only with the king, but he kept copies under the bed, in a chest. And locked wooden boxes passed through 3 generations of royal secret keepers. And one day, when the Tudor dynasty fell, those records would become the final testament to a rule by a rotting penis. You have no place in history books, but you might have a brief note in that nameless man's diary. 3rd night, autumn of Henry's 38th year. Subject, black hair, tall, slender hands, summoned after toad venom and cinnamon wine. King unresponsive, roared. Subject withdrew silently, left no scent. That's it. No medal, no gold coin, no honor. The secretary didn't intervene. He didn't save anyone, didn't help anyone. But he wrote. And because he wrote, the truth survived, though only in shadows. He was the only memory of the forgotten women, those summoned to the royal bed like disposable objects. And because of him, we now know Henry VIII didn't just kill wives with an axe, but with premeditated silence. If you think that night was private, you're wrong. It's a report presented the next morning, as the king eats mushroom soup, foot propped on a chair, asking what was written last night. And if the answer doesn't please him, you and your entire clan will vanish like you never existed. If you think staying silent, lying obediently, closing your eyes to get through is enough, wait until you learn, even with eyes shut, the secretary is listening. And he never forgets. But because he recorded everything, from staged moans to desperate sighs, a question has echoed for centuries, not just in Hampton Court's velvet-draped walls, but in modern libraries. Did Henry VIII truly love women, or did he simply love no one but himself? And the most debated question, sidelined from official histories but whispered in backstage notes, is, was Henry VIII not entirely heterosexual as thought? Tudor society tabooed homosexuality so fiercely that those caught loving the same sex could be hanged or burned. But in that repressed, secretive environment, unspeakable acts flourished, most quietly and violently. And Henry, who had the power to do anything to anyone, was no exception. Some modern historians, rereading letters, diaries, and the anonymous secretary's notes, found oddities. Like Henry's unusual closeness with certain male courtiers, Charles Brandon, Duke of Suffolk, Thomas Culpeper, and Mark Smeaton, the young harpist, executed for being too close to the Queen. Records show Henry summoned these men alone to his room late at night, gave them lavish gifts, even wept when they were executed. And no one can explain why Henry, who beheaded 2 wives without blinking, personally visited Thomas Culpeper's cell before his execution, just to stand silently for half an hour. Close friendship, maybe, but in an era where kissing the wrong hand could mean death, such closeness wasn't innocent. One note from the anonymous secretary reads, "4th night after the feast, His Majesty requested the brown-haired man to stay in the room until morning." No record of summoning a maid that night. Another time, Henry gifted a young soldier new to court a private room, a gold-saddled horse, and a red silk nightgown. Guards said the young man stayed in court just 7 nights, then vanished forever, never mentioned again. When asked, the king said only, he didn't suit the palace air. What was in that air to erase someone from history? You're about to enter a room thick with ambergris fumes and red light like a temple. Start to wonder, were the times the king couldn't rise with women, not due to age or illness, but because his body wasn't awakened the right way? Were his rages at maids, not being attractive, just anger at himself, when he could no longer deceive his own mind? The truth is, no one knows for sure, but the questions stem from odd repetitions. Marriages dissolved for lack of attraction, refusals to touch new wives, nights without maids, but with courtiers, wine and music. A Henry VIII obsessed with proving he was a man, yet the more he tried, the clearer his insecurity became. If he was bisexual, so what? With absolute power, able to command anyone, able to kill with a snap, gender was no limit. The issue wasn't who he loved, it was that he couldn't love anyone but himself. All the men he was close to were discarded once they no longer served his power fantasy. All the women who lay beneath him were punished when they made him feel impotent. Henry wasn't heterosexual, homosexual, or bisexual. Henry was powersexual. He didn't make love for pleasure. He did it to dominate, to crush, to confirm he was the universe's center, regardless of who lay beneath him, their gender, beauty, or consent. And you, watching your hair ribbon undone by the tired, rotting hand of a man whose eyes frantically search for something he can't name, realize the issue was never about gender. It was about the power pulsing through every attempt to force his body to do what it no longer wanted. If you think Henry VIII was just a lustful king, loving wives, hating wives, beheading wives, wait until you understand sex with him wasn't the goal. It was a weapon to prove he was still alive, and when it didn't work, he'd tear everything apart to avoid admitting he'd been dead for years. But before Henry VIII fully unraveled in the throes of power and sexual delusion, he left behind a legacy stranger, more painful and grander than any son he ever craved. Elizabeth I, the daughter of a loveless coupling, born to a beheaded mother, raised amid the stone-cold walls of a court with no room for compassion. Elizabeth was the result of the most infamous and cruelest affair of Henry's life, his liaison with Anne Boleyn. But calling it love is like calling an executioner a surgeon. No one in court ever saw Henry embrace Anne tenderly. No one heard him whisper sweet nothings beyond the bed. And Elizabeth, born in September 1533, was not the fruit of passion. She was the product of a biological contract, signed in sweat, blood, and disappointment. From the first moment, Elizabeth disappointed the king because she was a girl. Henry didn't hide his frustration at her christening, though he threw lavish celebrations, with fireworks lighting the night, in his heart, and in the royal secretary's diary, there was only one line about Elizabeth: not a son, period. Anne Boleyn, who preserved her virginity, refused the king for nearly a year to secure a legitimate marriage, who drove Henry to create a new religion to divorce his first wife, now became the sacrificial lamb for the king's biological failure. Every gesture, every time Anne held her daughter, was watched. Henry no longer saw her as a goddess. He saw her as a living reminder that he still lacked an heir. Elizabeth grew up in that heir. No mother, Anne was executed when Elizabeth was 3. No real father, Henry avoided her face after Anne's death. And no love. But she had sharp eyes, keen ears, a flawless memory, and the will of someone branded wrong gender from birth. No one taught Elizabeth how to survive the court, but she learned fast. Don't trust compliments. Don't show emotions. Don't believe power comes from gentleness. She quietly memorized every beheading, every exile, every person who whispered her mother's name with contempt, and then vanished. And that absolute isolation forged her into something no one expected, a queen who needed no husband. You, trembling in Henry's bed, his heavy hand on your chest, his ragged breath reeking of old wine, his body shaking with a rage he can't name. Imagine, Elizabeth was conceived on a night like this, a night without love, without tenderness, without a single gentle kiss, just a dutiful act to produce a child, and if that child wasn't a son, its mother would be flayed in the public eye, almost literally. What made Elizabeth great wasn't being raised with love, but growing from the wreckage her father left. She trusted no one, loved no one, married no one. She saw every courtier as a chess piece, even the closest, and you can't blame her. From the start, she was a wrinkle in the perfect tapestry. Henry meant to drape over the throne with a prince. Elizabeth survived political upheavals, imprisonments, treason accusations, and death threats, yet kept her head, her throne, and ultimately saved England from religious disaster. But to do so, she had to scrub away everything labeled daughter, Anne's child, product of a mistaken coupling. She made herself genderless, virgin queen, a woman owned by no one, letting no one near, never letting sex cloud her mind. And so, Elizabeth I can't be separated from Henry VIII's shadow, not because he raised her, but because he was the first cut in her life, a bloodless blade that slashed through any chance of love. If you think Elizabeth was a great queen only for her governance, wait until you see. She was the first woman to survive a world where every woman had to lie beneath Henry, and none walked away unbruised. She didn't lie down. She didn't love. She let no one into her bed. And that was the only way she survived. There was no loving anyone, no letting anyone into her bed, no letting any emotion take root. Because Elizabeth understood better than anyone, in the Tudor court, love wasn't a feeling. It was a tool, a weapon, a lure, a velvet-lined trap. And if anything outlasted executions, broken marriages, or bloody plots, it was deceit, dressed as love. She learned that from her father, Henry VIII, the man who married 6 women with fervent vows, then beheaded, discarded, or drove them to death for bearing the wrong child. In Henry's entire life, love was never the goal. It was a crown placed on power-driven couplings. He loved like an actor reciting lines, full of drama, but never sincere. Every "I love you" to Catherine of Aragon, Anne Boleyn, Jane Seymour was a heart-shaped curse. Love to possess, to own, to pull entire clans into his political machine, then crush them like grapes underfoot. And not just Henry. In this court, every declaration of love had a price. It could buy land, a cabinet seat, a military rank, a tax exemption, or most often, a life. A girl Henry called my perfect love could be banished for glancing elsewhere at dinner. A noble promised the king's hand for his daughter could lose his head for abusing emotional privilege. And when Catherine Howard, Henry's young wife, spoke too intimately with a courtier, no concrete proof was needed. Just a report of they had feelings was enough to sever her head. You, sitting on a silk-cushioned chair, waiting your turn to be called into the bedroom of a man who can't stand without toad venom and opium, ask yourself, that sweet smile he just gave you, what is it? Affection? Attraction? Or just an invitation to another performance, where you'll play the beloved in a one-night drama? Elizabeth, when crowned, said, "I am married to England." It wasn't just a vow against marriage. It was a curse she placed on herself, to never let love, or anything called love, make her a victim. She saw her mother killed, her aunt imprisoned, her friend hanged, all for the word love. Her father used too often, too carelessly, too falsely. And she swore she'd never trust. Love poured from the mouth of a man with power. In other dynasties, love might be a motive. In the Tudor court, love was a method of spiritual execution. It didn't come from the heart. It started at the fingertip, when a king pointed at a girl and said, "I like that one." Instantly, a machine sprang to life. Her mother fretted over dresses. Her father rushed to petition for titles. Her aunts prepared thank you notes for the king, noticing my niece. And while the family rejoiced, the girl, the one named, sat alone, trembling, unsure if this so-called love would bring a wedding gown or a shroud. Love in the royal court was alchemy. You gave a glance, a touch, a soft voice, and traded for survival. But if you dared love truly, if you let your heart beat off rhythm before a man with power, you became a threat. True love made you lose control of emotions, and those who couldn't control their tongues. In this court, where every secret was worth blood, it didn't tolerate those who spoke for love. You, who thought you'd try loving the king for favor, remember, love here isn't for reciprocation. Love is silent suicide. If you love openly, you'll be despised. If you love poorly, you'll be replaced. If you love and others know, you'll be killed. But if you pretend to love, you might live, even be rewarded. If you think sincerity will be accepted, wait until you see any woman shedding real tears in this court, branded as weak, unfit, unworthy of the king's bed. And the woman who smiles while her heart is shattered is the one kept. Because here, pain is an organ to hide. And don't think you can escape love's blade by citing morality or divinity. Because in the Tudor palace, even God waits outside the king's bedroom, or worse, gets dragged into the bed without a chance to object. Henry VIII wasn't just a bad lover, a wife killer like pruning branches. He used the church as bedroom furniture, a decoration, placed where convenient, smashed when no longer fitting. You can't talk about Henry VIII without mentioning the greatest sexual schism in royal history, when he tore ties with the Vatican, just to divorce his wife and marry his mistress. Yes, a religious reformation, a Europe-wide war, a new doctrine, all to serve a man desperate to drop his trousers. Before breaking with the Pope, Henry was devout. The Vatican once named him Defender of the Faith. But when Catherine of Aragon, his first wife, failed to bear a son, and Anne Boleyn refused to lie down without a queen's title, Henry decided, if the church won't allow it, I'll make a new one. And so the Church of England was born, not from the Holy Spirit, but from pent-up sexual rage. And you think that only affected politics? No, it changed how Henry made love. Before, each time he went to bed, he'd make the sign of the cross. The bed had to face east, where the sun rose, symbolizing life. But after breaking with the Vatican, he changed the rules so the bed could face any direction, as long as it was easy to undress. Evening prayers were replaced with wine laced with aphrodisiac herbs, and the commandment against adultery was rewritten. Adultery, unless permitted by the king. Henry turned the church into his lust's waiting room. He appointed bishops based on, will this man stop me from marrying again? He rewrote prayer books, cutting parts urging fidelity. And in Sunday sermons, instead of preaching sacrifice, priests were ordered to praise the king's supreme authority in marriage. A man who could cast off the Pope just to bed who he wanted. Where would he stop? Nowhere. He turned religion into a bed pillow. And you, waiting to serve His Majesty tonight, must be more careful with every word, because if you quote scripture to refuse him, you'll be branded a heretic. But if you misquote scripture to please him, you could be beheaded for twisting holy will. A common sight in Henry's court was after a wine-soaked feast, a priest rewriting the Bible by hand, while the king, unbuckling his belt, asked, "Does God really forbid this?" And if the priest hesitated for a second, he'd be replaced with someone more confident in faith. Henry didn't defy God, he redefined God to match his carnal whims. Each time he loved someone, he asked, "How can I marry her without breaking the law?" If he couldn't, he changed the law. If the law couldn't change, he changed the lawmakers. And if the lawmakers refused, he changed religion. You, who thought you could use dogma, scripture, or moral precepts to avoid the king's bed, remember in this court, morality isn't a compass, it's a knife, and Henry sharpens it to his liking. Anne Boleyn prayed all night, reading scripture in a locked room, hoping God would shield her from Henry's wrath. 3 days later she was beheaded. Catherine Howard had a priest write her confession, hoping for forgiveness. A week later, her head rolled under the axe, and Catherine Parr, the last wife, only survived because she became the best scripture reader Henry ever slept with. If you think Henry only killed with swords, you're wrong. He killed with doctrine, with scripture, by forcing others to believe that to live, they must believe in his desires, and if they didn't, they'd burn as heretics. So when you enter that bedroom tonight and see a cross beside a vial of aphrodisiac, don't wonder. It's the ultimate symbol of Henry VIII's reign, where sex and religion shared a bed, and God was only kept if he stayed silent at the right time. But not everyone in court was good at silence, especially on nights when it wasn't Henry needing caresses, but the Queen craving a hand with real vitality, a body not rotting, a pulse not laced with toad venom. And so, a question buried under moral stone began leaking like water through a palace roof. Who dared make the Queen happy, without the king knowing? Rumors abounded, about a lingering glance beyond courtesy between a young musician and Queen Catherine Howard, about a maid catching the Queen sneaking from her room at midnight, hair disheveled, lips red, heart racing too fast to fix her nightgown, about the sudden death of a guard patrolling the inner court, after accidentally passing the Queen's room twice in one night. In Henry's world, betrayal didn't need bedroom proof. Mere suspicion was enough to lose your head. And so, anyone who made the Queen happy without being caught wasn't brave. They were tightrope walkers, on a blade thinner than a hair. Maybe you're picturing passionate affairs, clandestine escapes, love letters folded and hidden in pillows. But the truth is colder. Most of those joys didn't start with love. They started with despair. A woman left neglected, wiping pus from her husband's leg nightly, inhaling lingering aphrodisiac fumes, enduring a massive, groaning body, pressing down, no emotion, no kind words. One day, a young guard forgets his handkerchief in the corridor. She bends to pick it up, and for the first time in months, a man looks at her like she's alive, and so it begins. Some men knew the line they crossed. They weren't naive. They knew if caught, there'd be no trial, only the executioner, but they did it anyway. For a very Tudor reason, one secret night with the Queen could change a life. It could earn her backing. It could produce an unofficial royal-blooded child, and one day, enough to bargain with the court. You, bowing your head, tasked with bringing late-night tea to the Queen, might be the third party stumbling into this silent war. You don't know why she asks you to stay, even for a minute, why she rests her hand on your shoulder and asks, "Are you tired?" Why her gaze lingers on your sleeve's wrist, and her breath softens. But you know, if you answer wrong, you won't live to your next shift. And Henry, he wasn't foolish, just arrogant. He believed no one dared touch what was his, even when he'd neglected it. But sometimes, he sensed it, a strange bite mark on the Queen's shoulder, an unfamiliar sweat scent on a pillow, a smile from her he knew he didn't cause. And then, he quietly set spies. And when found, no trial needed, just betrayed the king's sacred body. The man was executed first, torn apart in the square. Then the woman declared the snake that bit the nation's holy spear. Though every night before, she had to feign ecstasy to please a man who no longer heard his own heartbeat. If you think the only danger in the king's bedroom was Henry, wait until you see the neglected woman wielding her gaze like a honed sword. And the men who thought themselves lucky were the ones about to die. Some escaped. Few, a guard rumored to have made the Queen smile 3 times in a week, suddenly vanished from court. A year later, he was spotted living in a forest under a false name, with a new wife, never speaking of his past. Some said he was mad. Others, just wise enough to survive after learning. In the Tudor palace, bedding the Queen was juggling your own head. If you think this couldn't happen today, you've never stepped where power and lust share a bed. And if you think someone made the Queen happy without being caught, Maybe, but they didn't tell. Because those who told didn't survive. Because in the Tudor palace, sometimes surviving didn't mean being spared, it meant being forgotten. And if you think you can dodge danger by stepping back, quitting the game, living humbly in the kitchen or corridor shadows, you don't understand how Henry VIII's court worked. Because though England had no harem in the Eastern sense, every woman in the palace, from queen to maid, from noble lady to bedsheet keeper, was always on call. No harem, true, no separate building for women, no hundreds of titled consorts, ranked like in Asian empires. But look closely at Hampton Court's corridors, where light slips through tiny door cracks and guards' ears perk like hounds. Every space in the palace could become the king's temporary bedroom. Every woman could be summoned at any time, because the king was the center, and around him, nothing was stable. Today he adored Jane Seymour. Tomorrow he noticed a young maid carrying a wine tray. The next day he recalled a glance from last spring's feast. No fixed list, no schedule, just a sudden order through a trusted courtier. Tonight, the king wants her. Her could be anyone. The seamstress who just finished a cloak's hem, the maid sweeping the great hall, the earl's daughter visiting the queen. No one could refuse, no one could ask why. And if you thought not being called meant safety, you're wrong. Because every woman the king didn't notice was also judged for not being attractive enough, lacking respectful demeanor, showing indifference to power. Living in the Tudor palace was perpetual preparation. Dresses had to be tight enough to allure, but not so revealing as to be deemed provocative. Perfume had to be fragrant, but not overpowering. The king might be allergic. Voices had to be soft, steps light, but answers quick and smiles timed right. One slip in demeanor, and you could be struck from the random selection pool. And being struck was as dangerous as being chosen. Why? Because when the king asked, "Where's that one?" if the answer was, "I thought her unsuitable," you, the one who spoke, would be the next under scrutiny. Unsuitable meant what? Sick, disdainful of the king, involved with someone else. A maid was once banned from court just for bowing too quickly as the king passed. You, barely through one winter in the palace, must now learn to live like you're in a play. No script, no cue, no idea if the director will call your name, but you must always be ready. Like an item in a glass case, just 1 point from the king, and you must know how to shine. No one says it outright, but everyone knows the rules. Matrons will quietly teach you how to breathe, how to lie still when your thigh is touched, how to laugh at personal questions, how to cry without smudging lip rouge, because you don't know which night you'll be called, and if called you can't tremble. Henry VIII didn't need a harem. He needed a palace where every woman was in a waiting line. No one knew who was first. No one knew if their name was still on the list. That ambiguity forced everyone to stay as alluring as possible, not to be loved, but to not be discarded. If you think you can avoid the game by not being beautiful, wrong. If you think you can escape by being sick, also wrong. In Henry's eyes, women weren't people with the right to refuse. They were options on standby, like dishes at a feast. And if you weren't chosen to eat, you still had to be kept as decoration. One woman wrote in a secret diary, "I'm 18, not the prettiest, but I learned to smile like Anne Boleyn, walk like Jane Seymour, and look like Elizabeth before she was queen, so I've never been called, but never been banished." That's the pinnacle of survival. If you think no harem means women were safe, wait until you see a royal feast where every woman sits, straight-backed, eyes shy yet hopeful, dresses unwrinkled, necks blemish-free, because one wrong gesture, you might be summoned or banished from court forever. In a place where sex is politics, choice is an order, and the king's gaze can be a death sentence or a ticket to eternity. A harem doesn't need to be a building. It lives in the mind, in heartbeats, in the sweat beading every night before roll call. And you, whoever you are, never truly escape it. Because in the Tudor court, you weren't born to live for yourself. You existed to be ready, ready for the king's glance, for sudden orders, for unannounced touches. And if you had desires, sorry, that was a sin, unless you were the king. In a kingdom where a stroke of hair could be deemed provocative, where two people secretly holding hands in a chapel could be accused of lechery, where women wore 3 layers of skirts just to uphold decency, Henry VIII acted as if his body was the inviolable territory of divinity. Because here, sex was a crime, but if you were the king, You didn't sin. You bestowed favor. Yes. A 16-year-old boy caught sneaking a glance at a noble woman's skirt could be beaten to death. But if Henry VIII stood in the Great Hall and declared he wanted to see the bare legs under that dress, it was an honor for her entire lineage. A girl forced by a court official would be branded loose and banished from the palace. But if the same act came from the king, history would call it a fateful encounter. See the injustice. Everything sinful for commoners became a national ritual when the king did it, and people accepted it, not because they didn't see, but because they were too afraid to speak. Imagine you're a young girl, newly chosen as a maid for the queen. One night, the king is drunk. He stumbles into your room, calls the wrong name, and gives you no time to resist. The next morning, you tell someone. They ask, "Did the king force you?" You say, "I didn't consent." They ask again, "But did you fight back?" You stay silent. That's it. No proof of force, no injuries, just your word against a man seen as the embodiment of divine power. So, you become the problem.
Not a victim, but a threat to court order.
And you're banished, or you disappear. Henry VIII wasn't the only one exempt in this game, but he took it to the absolute because he believed his body was the nation's symbol. In other words, every time he had sex, it wasn't about satisfying lust, it was performing power. Every thrust, every moan, every drop of sweat on someone's chest was the continuation of royal authority. You, just hearing that a girl was banished from court for failing the king's expectations, start to understand, if you don't like this, you're wrong. If you feel violated, you're weak. And if you dare speak out, you're defying the nation. There's a story few dared mention. A young courtier, after being forced by the king in a drunken haze, planned to report it. He wrote a letter, discreetly passed to a bishop. A week later, his body was found in a palace well. The death was recorded as an accident from slipping. The letter never reached anyone, but guards said a man who slips doesn't stuff rocks in his pockets to weigh himself down. That's how the court worked. Truth was curated, sin was redefined, and desire, if from the king, was sanctified. And you, who just wanted to live quietly, do your job, neither stand out nor fade away, still can't escape. Because sometimes, your mere presence is enough to make the king want to try. And if he tries, you must feel honored. If you don't, you're disloyal. If you think being plain, unalluring, will keep you safe, wrong. Because Henry didn't choose based on beauty, he chose by whim. Some nights, he wanted blondes. Some nights, he picked someone limping. Some nights, a slender hand was reason enough to summon them to his room. And each time, whether you trembled, wanted to run, or prayed for God's salvation, you still had to thank him. Because if you didn't, you were insulting the nation's sacred body. Sex, under Henry VIII, had no consent, only acceptance. And if you didn't accept, you were judged, not by a sword, but by erasure, slander, being branded a disruptor of the non-existent harem. If you think this injustice died with the era, wrong, it just changed shape. But in the Tudor court, it was written into law, and that law, only the king was unbound by it. Because he didn't sin, he was the law. And that law didn't just rule the living. It weighed on those who'd once belonged to him, even when they were no longer wives, no longer official property of the throne. Because if you were the man who came after Henry VIII, in any way, even marrying one of his former wives, you weren't just taking a wife, you were touching royal remnants. And to touch that, you had to be cleansed, not with soap, with a ritual. A bizarre, solemn, half-superstitious, half-psychologically terrorizing ceremony the Tudor court called the purification of the post-king. It sounded like a religious rite, but in truth, it was a public moral and psychological trial for any man bold enough to marry, or even sleep with, a woman who'd lain under the king. Thomas Seymour, Jane Seymour's brother, Henry's third wife, faced this. After the king's death, Thomas secretly courted Catherine Parr, the sixth wife, the only one to survive Henry. When rumors spread that they were in love, or more than love, the court erupted, not from jealousy, from fear. Fear that a mere man dared succeed the king's body, even when the king was dead. So the court forced Thomas through the purification. He had to swear before a council of nobles that his feelings for Catherine were pure, free of lust, and permitted by God, not driven by desire for the royal surplus. He had to wear a white cloak, stand under a cathedral dome, wash his hands in water with a silver coin, symbolizing upright intent, then bow 3 times to the empty throne. Only then could he officially call Catherine his wife. And even so, he was still suspected, watched, rumored to mimic how the king once lay, slandered that she never moaned as loudly as with Henry. And 3 years later, he was executed for plotting to seize the throne. But everyone knew his real crime was daring to love someone the king had loved. You, a man before a mirror, adjusting your collar for a feast where you'll dance with a royal widow. Know every step toward her is a step into forbidden land, not because she still loves Henry, but because Henry, even dead, left his shadow on every inch of skin he touched. And she, that woman, isn't free. She can't remarry like a normal person. Every new relationship is vetted, watched, judged as if she's an offering now too tainted to belong to anyone else. There was even a case where a young noble proposed to a discarded consort and was forced to write a 12-page essay on the meaning of purity after royal marriage. And you think it's just about honor? No, it's a tool to control memory. Henry could die, but the women he owned, whether by marriage or midnight orders, were never allowed to love freely again. The purification rite, then, wasn't to cleanse the man. It was to remind him, you're second. You come after a god. Know your place. And the women? They had to perform. Perform that the wedding night wasn't a reenactment of an old wound. That this new hand was gentle enough to erase the cold grip of past power. That they loved, softly, without comparison, without recalling the ragged breaths of the man who once ruled them with his body. And if they slipped, uttering an old name in a dream, if they flinched, surprised their new husband didn't fold a sleeve like Henry did, they had to grit their teeth, because they weren't allowed to remember. If you think loving a former queen is normal, wait until you see the courtier's eyes fixed on your hand as you rest it on her waist, as if you've stepped on a sacred relic. The Tudor court didn't forgive those who entered the king's memory without permission, and permission sometimes wasn't enough. You had to kneel, prove, swear you wouldn't do anything to make people think you enjoyed it more than the king did. And if you survived the purification, good, but you'd always know every act of love after wasn't between 2 people. It was between one who loved and one apologizing for once belonging to a king. But it wasn't just those who touched the king who had to apologize. History itself had to bend and beg Henry's pardon, because after he died, when his flesh had rotted, his festering pus stopped seeping, and his pained moans no longer echoed at night, the court, church, and historians declared in unison, he was a robust, mighty man, potent to his final breath. So if you thought death would unveil the truth, Henry VIII is proof reborn that reputation can be entombed in gold-stitched silk lies. The truth is, when Henry died in 1547, he was no longer the man who hunted on horseback all day without sweating. He was a 400-pound mass, unable to stand alone, unable to urinate without a copper tube, rotting so badly guards sprayed perfume around his room all night to mask the stench. But in the royal obituary, he was described as vigorous with the potency of 10 men and a mind clear to the end. And you know who wrote those words? The ones who buried their true feelings nightly to feign ecstasy, who bowed when he could no longer rise, yet still praised, His Majesty is as mighty as thunder, who wiped his blood, his pus, his fear, and now had to wipe history to make it shine. Henry was buried at St. George's Chapel in Windsor Castle, beside Jane Seymour, the only wife who bore a son, not because he loved her most, but because she died early, before she could betray, react, or reflect the truth. So, and as his coffin was lowered, the entire court stood solemnly, pretending not to smell the rot seeping from the wax-sealed casket. Then came memorials, then bronze statues, then history books, then paintings, and in each, Henry VIII emerged as a Tudor Hercules, broad-chested, square-jawed, eyes blazing, like he'd just had a night of passion without sleep. No word mentioned he couldn't touch anyone for his last 3 years. No record spoke of the maid's silent tears, called only to watch the king rage in impotence. No one said Henry's sexual power died before his heart stopped. You, studying history, reading Henry's biography with his image standing proud in a red velvet cloak, think, this was a desirable man. But you don't know that image is fear's product. No one dared paint him frail. No one dared sculpt his swollen feet, unfit for shoes. And so, history painted a man who no longer existed, a shadow dressed in lies. There's a small, forbidden tale. A painter once tasked with Henry's portrait in his final year painted the truth, bloated belly, puffy face, bleary eyes. The painting was burned, and the painter vanished from court. The replacement is what you see today. Henry standing like thunder, hand on hip, eyes defying heaven and earth, and everyone repeated the praise, like a ritual. This is the man who never fell. If you think death tolls the bell for truth, Henry VIII shows you truth must queue before the throne, even when it's overgrown with straw and thorns. After death, Henry could no longer make love, but he was still hailed as the man with dragon's blood. He no longer breathed, but they wrote, even gone, his breath shapes centuries, and the women who lay beside or beneath him were never allowed to tell what really happened, because their stories were buried in a second coffin, the casket of silence. You think truth alone is enough, but in Tudor times, truth didn't exist if it didn't serve power, and Henry, even after death, proved it. He was no longer a real man, but history didn't dare say so, because it still knelt before him. If you ever wondered how the weakest man could be remembered as the mightiest, the answer is by making the entire court stay silent, in fear, in pity, and in the tradition of painting lipstick on a corpse. And if they painted lipstick on a corpse, how could they ignore what every courtier knew, but none dared say aloud, Henry VIII's manhood? The thing once seen as the empire's life force, the thing that killed 2 wives, warped a religion, and forced countless women to moan in silence. Now a historical question, was it a mighty sword, or just a broken blade, feared only because a kingdom pretended to tremble? No statue captured its true shape, no painting dared detail it, but legends spread. Some records claimed he had the largest manhood among Europe's nobility. Historians who wrote that got titles, servants who whispered, I saw it, not that impressive, vanished from chronicles, because Henry's manhood wasn't a body part, it was a propaganda tool, an extension of power. Some nights, guards said the king, limping, would summon a maid at midnight, shouting, prepare, I bring the iron sword. But other whispers, from girls called to his room, leaving 3 minutes later, pale, silent, told a different story. One was rumored to have whispered to a friend, it's not big, but he forced me to believe it was, and that was the real terror. In a chambermaid's diary, who washed the king's sheets, she wrote, the cloth is never wet, only sweat, no sign of coupling. But the morning report always says, the night His Majesty conquered. That line repeated for weeks, months, and became truth, a truth needing no proof, just enough people staying silent. Henry once boasted to courtiers, they write of Alexander the Great, but no one asks how long his sword was. The room laughed, but no one dared ask back. And yours? No one dared, because even curiosity was treason. Some physicians' notes say Henry suffered groin abscesses late in life, making urination and intercourse agonizing. Others wrote of salves from peacock fat and gold powder to sustain strength. But when asked directly, all shook their heads, saying, that's His Majesty's private matter. That privacy was guarded, not for respect, but because speaking meant execution. You who heard Henry as the conqueror of the northern harem know this. What he conquered most wasn't women, but silence. He forced a court to believe in something he wasn't sure worked, and slowly, his manhood became a myth, like Excalibur, unseen in truth, but all had to believe it grand. There's a counter-legend. When Henry died, a female physician glanced at his lower body and muttered, God, and that shook Europe. She was banished from court, never heard from again, but her words, like a crack in a stone statue, lingered in torn pages, unsigned letters. Those whispers never made history books, but they survived, like moles on a mummified corpse, untouched, always there. And if you still believe Henry's manhood was the weapon that made women tremble, wait until you see what made them shake wasn't size, but the power behind it. A power that could make a kingdom pretend every failed thrust was thunder, every impotence the fault of the moon's wrong phase. If it was truly grand, fine. If not, no matter. Because Henry didn't need to make love to be worshipped. He just needed others to fear he could. And that fear, not flesh, made his sword immortal. When later historians wrote of Henry VIII, they debated policies, the church, wars, but none dared touch what he carried between his legs, not for lack of evidence, but because touching it meant touching the illusion of power, still haunting every stone of Hampton Court. And illusions, you know, don't need to be real to kill. They just need enough people to believe they are. And when an entire kingdom believes in something unproven, it's no longer truth, it's power. And Henry VIII lived, loved, ruled, and killed with that power. Sex, not sex as you know it, pleasure, connection, thrill, but sex as psychological control, a velvet-lined shackle, an obsession cloaked in laughter and moans. Sex in Henry's hands was never an act, it was an ideology, a mechanism to make others look up, admire, fear, and most importantly, feel inferior. And who needs that most? Not the strong, but the weak, the psychologically frail who need everyone around them to play a script they can no longer perform themselves. Henry VIII wasn't addicted to sex. He was addicted to the feeling of others thinking he was good at it. He didn't need intercourse to satisfy. He needed courtiers' whispers, maids' fake longing glances, poems praising muscles gone flabby and hands that trembled, because he was afraid. Afraid of being forgotten. Afraid of not being the center. Afraid that one day, entering a room, no one would stand. You'd think the powerful fear nothing, but the truth is, the more powerful, if psychologically weak, the deeper the fear roots. And Henry, after all his conquests, executions, nights summoning people to his bed, only to fail, grew more frantic. Each physical failure scratched a soul already cracked, and he patched it with violence, pretense, forcing the entire court to repeat, "He's still so strong." Sex, for him, was a way to prove existence, not of himself, but of the image he wanted others to see, an illusion inflated by power and coercion. And you, stumbling into that room, must bow, moan, and feign honor, though you're only lying beside a human-shaped panic. A secret letter, stored in the church's archives, records a priest who heard the king confess, "I no longer desire, but I can't let others know. I fear being seen as weak. I fear being left." Not a confession, a cry for help from a soul trapped in a body overhyped. And no one helped, because no one dared admit that behind the sexual power was an aging child, terrified of being forgotten. You think sexual obsession comes from lack? No, it comes from being bound to a self-image society built. When all Europe called Henry the king of 1,000 nights of passion, he had no choice but to keep performing, though his body was exhausted, his mind frayed, because if he stopped, who was he? A man who failed, a rotting body, or worse, a king no longer potent. Sex is power, but only for those not consumed by it. For Henry, it was a snake he fed and let coil around his neck. The tighter it squeezed, the harder he strained. And the more he strained, the more his insecurity showed that no one truly wanted him. They just didn't want to be killed by him. You, sitting in a bedroom, smelling of damp wood and pine resin, hearing the king's labored breathing behind the curtain, realize he doesn't see you as a person. He sees you as a mirror, a reflector to make him believe he's still attractive, still fearsome, still able to sway someone with desire. And if you look back, if your eyes show pity, disgust, or mere indifference, he'll collapse or kill you before that happens. Because in the psyche of the weak, the ego can't bear silence. It needs moans, praise, screams. Without them, it thinks it's dead. Henry VIII didn't die from necrosis, not from obesity, not from gout. He died because no one was scared enough to pretend he was still alive. And that's the greatest tragedy for a man who used sex as armor. In the end, no one touched him anymore. Not from fear, but from being too tired to keep lying. If you ever dreamed of power so great that people bed you unwillingly, wait until you see Henry VIII in his final year, a lonely king, lying among hundreds of maids, yet feeling abandoned. And you'll understand, sex is power. But power doesn't save the psychologically weak. It only makes them die in a room full of mirrors. with no one truly wanting to look. Because in the end, what Henry VIII craved wasn't women's bodies, but validation that he still had power, was still the center, was still feared. But when others' eyes showed only exhaustion, when moans turned to silence, when faces looked at him with polite pity, he knew the game was over. And so he died, not in someone's arms, not amid prayers, but in the stench of medicine and the sound of guards changing shifts. His body was wrapped in layers of waxed cloth, placed in a coffin thick as a fortress wall. But one thing was never buried: the memories of those who lay in his bed. You, if you were one of them, would you tell? Would you tell of the first time he called you, gripping your shoulder, smiling but eyes cold? Would you tell how he undressed slowly, as if performing for an invisible audience? Would you tell of the fermented wine on his breath, the sweat mixed with ointment, the smell of a man trying too hard to make others believe he was still a man? Would you tell that he couldn't, or that he tried? Or would you choose the simpler path, say nothing at all? Because you know, that story told right or wrong, nobody believes. If you say he was brutal, they'll call you a liar, seeking fame. If you say he was gentle, they'll ask if you're mad. If you say he was impotent, you'll be accused of blasphemy. And if you say he just wanted to be held, nothing more, they'll laugh. Because that image doesn't fit the steel-forged monument of history, not flesh. You know every story will be doubted, twisted, turned into something serving the bigger tale. The story of a great, sensual, lustful king who killed wives, but was loved by women. And you, a nobody, can't fight that myth machine. You also remember those who spoke. A maid who wrote in a letter that he cried when I turned away. The letter never arrived. She vanished a week later. An old courtier who whispered that the king sleeps, but fears no one cares to look. He was sent to the frontier for insulting the royal image. A secret scribe who recorded the king's dream, where Henry said, "I want someone to love me for Henry, not the king." That diary burned with him. You see, the real story is always what no one wants to hear, so you stay silent. You don't tell of the time he just needed you to hold his hand. Don't tell of the lost look when he asked, "Do you think I'm still strong?" Don't tell of his breathing, long and empty, like wind through a vacant room. You bury it all in the darkest corner of your memory, because speaking costs safety, but keeping it costs peace. If you find this dark historical truth worth hearing, please subscribe to not miss the next stories, where power, sex, and loneliness always wear new masks. Thank you for staying until the end, and see you in the next exploration of history's hidden corners.